So I'm Sally Bachman. I want to welcome you to this event tonight. Thank you for coming out on a Red Sox home game night. Of course, it is against the Yankees, so we can be rooting from a distance. I direct the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health. I want to begin by thanking Maddie Walkman, who, if I know Maddie, is not here. She's outside, who really has been, there she is, who, like everything for the center, is the brains behind everything we do. We have an exciting panel tonight. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Betty Ruth, who's going to talk a little bit more before we dive into our content. But before we do, I want to let you know that if you want to tweet about our event, it's #SchoolsNotPrisons. Thanks to our communications specialist, Edie Oblowski. And the hashtag is on both sides. And also to let you know that Edie is going to be taking some photographs of the event tonight. So if you would prefer not to be in a photograph, just give her the hi sign, something like this that says, or duck, as Edie says. Without further ado, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Betty Ruth, who is the director of the MSW MPH program at the School of Public Health, and has been an inspiration for many of us about thinking about social work in a transdisciplinary context. So.
Thank you, Sally. As Sally said, my name is Betty. I'm a clinical professor at Boston University School of Social Work, and I really want to welcome you here tonight. As principal investigator for our Advancing Leadership in Public Health Social Work Education project, it's a pleasure to be partnering with the Boston University School of Social Work Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health to provide today's program. Tonight's program is entitled Preventing the School-to-Prison Pipeline, an innovative collaboration between social work, legal services, and public health. This is the 5th program in this grant's year-long series aimed at elevating the role of public health social workers in interprofessional and collaborative partnerships aimed at addressing issues of deep social injustice in our state and in our nation. I want to now introduce Estrella Augsburger, my friend and colleague who will serve as tonight's moderator, and she's going to get us started. Dr. Augsburger is assistant professor at Boston University School of Social Work. She is a licensed clinical social worker with over a decade of practice experience working with people working alongside attorneys representing children and youth in New York City's family courts. Her research program focuses on improving policy, programs, and practice for children involved in social welfare and in child welfare programs, in juvenile justice, and in mental health systems, with a particular emphasis on elevating youth voice in decision-making processes. Thank you, Estrella, and here you go.
Thank you, Betty. So I feel really honored. Is my mic working? Yes? Yes? Good. I'm really honored to be here to moderate this really important and timely panel. We were very, very excited about the excitement of all of you in terms of registering for the panel. We actually had to move spaces because there was so much excitement around this event. So I wanted to get a sense of who is in the room. So if you could just raise your hand as I call out. So social workers, social work practitioners, faculty, students, alumni, great. And public health practitioners, students, alumni, fantastic. Attorney, law students, faculty, any? Okay. And educators, education students, fantastic, great. And others? Others that I missed? Sally, you're social work faculty. Yeah. Great. So it's exciting to see so many disciplines in attendance, as we are going to be talking about important partnerships. And it's really important for disciplines to partner around these issues. So we're really fortunate to have panelists here to present on an innovative new partnership called the School Exclusion Prevention Initiative. It's a collaboration aimed at disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline in Boston. And the project involves a partnership between the Justice Resource Institute Dimock CSA office, which is the provider of the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative, CBHI Services, and Massachusetts Advocates for Children, a nonprofit education advocacy organization which conducts direct legal representation and systemic advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children and youth in Massachusetts. Through the partnership, JRI and Mass Advocates serve clients primarily in Roxbury, Mission Hill, Jamaica Plain, and Dorchester. I'd like to welcome our panelists. Their full bios are in your programs. And so we have Vinnie Fong. LCSW is an intensive care coordinator at JRI Dimock CSA. She provides CBHI services to children and family. Maria Dixon is a senior family partner at JRI. She also provides CBHI services to children and families. Stephanie Molina is an attorney at Mass Advocates for Children, and she provides consultation to the JRI social workers and represents JRI clients in school discipline and special education cases. She specializes in working with Latino Spanish-speaking clients. Liza Hirsch is an attorney at Mass Advocates for Children, and she oversees the partnership, represents clients in special education and school discipline matters, and conducts systemic advocacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Liza, who's going to start the conversation with a brief overview of the school-to-prison pipeline.
Okay, is this working? All right, so it's amazing to see all of you here, and it was amazing to hear about the incredible interest in this issue and the commitment to this issue. We're going to try to move through the description of the work that we're doing as efficiently as possible, as I suspect that there are many of you in the audience who actually also have expertise in this issue. And so we do want to open it up as quickly as possible so that we can have a dialogue about these issues. I'm going to give a brief overview about the school-to-prison pipeline. This is basically just to serve as a foundation and to kind of put the discussion into some legal and historical context. So what is the school-to-prison pipeline? I assume that if you're sitting here in this room, probably most of you have a pretty good idea of what the school-to-prison pipeline is, but just so that we're all on the same page, the school-to-prison pipeline refers to a series of harsh disciplinary practices, such as school exclusion and student arrest, which make it more likely that a child is going to end up having contact with the criminal justice system. The school-to-prison pipeline and these kinds of disciplinary practices disproportionately affect students of color, specifically Black and Latino students, students with disabilities, and low-income students. I also just wanted to emphasize that this is really a systemic issue. So there are lots of people within the system. There are lots of teachers and social workers and school psychologists who are doing really important work in the system and trying to reverse these trends. But the systemic picture still exists, and that's what people are working within the system and outside of the system to try to reverse. So how did we get here? In 1993, as part of the era on tough on crime policies, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law called the Massachusetts Education Reform Act, which expanded the authority of principals to exclude students in schools. It was after that point in time that my organization, Mass Advocates for Children, began receiving calls from parents about their children who were excluded from school. So I think this is important because I think some of us assume that the school-to-prison pipeline, it's kind of always existed and it's always been this way, but actually there were a series of things that happened in history that led us to where we are today. So that was a critical moment in 1993 in Massachusetts when principals gained more authority to exclude students. And then importantly, in 1999, after the Columbine shooting, nationwide, there was a wave of placing police officers in schools, and also an increase in the implementation of zero tolerance policies. So unfortunately, police officers in schools, sorry about that. Unfortunately, police officers in schools have not stopped school shootings, but what they have done is arrest hundreds of thousands of low-income students of color for minor disciplinary offenses. So I actually wanted to read a quote from a student of color at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, following the recent school shooting, which I think really is really powerful and really captures some of the dynamics going on here. The student said, "The police are turning our school into a police state. Every day, students are losing more and more freedoms. Students of color, black and brown students like myself, have been racially profiled and are on heightened alert while fearing the emergent aggression to make decisions around school disciplinary incidents." And I also wanted to make the point that research has shown that zero tolerance policies actually don't make schools safer. So we do have some good news. In Massachusetts, we passed a new law on school discipline called Chapter 222 of the Acts of 2012. It went into effect on July 1st, 2014. I spend much of my time working to implement this law, and also Stephanie and others on the panel are working alongside me in working to implement this law. This is a law that addresses minor disciplinary offenses. So in Massachusetts, disciplinary infractions are kind of split into two categories. There's the more serious kinds of offenses, and then there are the less serious kinds of offenses. On the more serious side, you have weapons, drugs, assault on educational staff. So we call those the three deadly sins. If a student commits one of those offenses, they're not going to have as many rights because those are pretty serious. However, there's a whole lot of other kinds of disciplinary offenses that students engage in that are just kind of typical, kind of childhood, adolescent behaviors. Things like talking back at a teacher or getting into a fight with another student, things like that. And what my office found was that under zero tolerance policies, all of the offenses, even the really minor offenses, were getting swept under zero tolerance policies, and students were getting excluded and harshly punished regardless of really how serious the offense was. So even if it was like, they threw a piece of bread across the room and it didn't hit anyone, they were still getting harshly punished. So Chapter 222 addresses those kinds of offenses. It doesn't address weapons, drugs, assault on educational staff. It addresses everything else. So it addresses all of the more minor kinds of disciplinary offenses. And the law does a few things. It makes clear, first of all, that students who are excluded from school must still be educated. So this is something that is actually pretty shocking, that I'm saying that this was a major accomplishment, that in 2014 we passed a law where students who are excluded from school still have the right to do their homework, make up assignments, take quizzes, but this is something that we actually had to get written into the law. So any student who is suspended from school for any period of time has the right to make up assignments, take quizzes, keep up with their schoolwork, and that if a student is excluded for more than 10 days at a time, they have to be provided what's called alternative educational services. So that could be home tutoring or online coursework or some way for them to continue to receive an education even though they're excluded. So that's one thing that the law accomplished. A second thing it accomplished is that it encourages the use of alternatives to suspension. So these are things like restorative justice, peer mediation, conflict resolution, things that research has really shown are actually much more effective than suspending and excluding a student from school. It's actually, research has shown time and time again that it's actually not effective to exclude students. It doesn't change their behavior, and what happens is they just tend to fall further and further behind. They're more likely to be retained in school and more likely to ultimately drop out and then become engaged in the criminal justice system. So the law encourages schools to use alternatives like restorative justice, like peer mediation, like positive behavioral supports. It requires schools to use alternatives to suspension prior to a long-term suspension, which is defined as more than 10 days. And then it expands due process rights for students. So before a student is suspended, they have to be provided notice and a hearing. And that's one of the laws that my team and I are working very hard to implement and enforce in the field. And then it also, it kind of brings back discretion so that principals have discretion to make a decision. In every circumstance, they can make the decision not to suspend. So they still can decide to suspend, but they have more discretion. So they can decide, you know what, under these circumstances, I'm not going to suspend this student. I'm going to decide to utilize restorative justice. So these are really, really strong elements of the law. It doesn't mean that all of these things are yet happening in practice. This is why we're kind of out here in the field doing this work. And since this law took effect in 2014, there has been a decrease in reported suspensions overall. But I really wanted to emphasize that disparities still exist. Significant disparities still exist by income, race, and disability. So on the left, these are numbers from before Chapter 222 took effect in 2014, but the numbers haven't significantly changed. So 1 in 27 white students were suspended, while 1 in 10 Latino students were suspended, and 1 in 8 black students were suspended. On the right, this chart actually reflects the very most recent data that we have, which was put out by the State Department of Education. And this is data from the Boston Public Schools from last school year, which is 2016 to 17. And it shows, you can just see, it shows the disparities. So 1.4% of all white students were disciplined, 6.6% of all black students were disciplined, and 4.4% of all Latino students were disciplined. And you can just see the disparities, which are still very stark. I did want to mention that racial gaps have decreased slightly since the law took effect. One of my colleagues, who's a data guru, made sure that I mentioned that we don't want people to think there's been no progress. They have decreased slightly, but there are still significant and really serious disparities by race, income, and disability. So this next slide shows, again, some of the disparities. And you can see here, this chart shows the lost instructional time. And you can see that black students, Latino students, and students with disabilities lost the most instructional time due to having been suspended. This is also data from the Boston Public Schools. So I wanted to also speak about student arrests, because this is another way in which students are kind of funneled actually quite directly into the school-to-prison pipeline. This is from a study conducted a few years ago by the Citizens for Juvenile Justice and the ACLU. And it showed pretty significant disparities. It was a study that looked at the 3 biggest school districts in Massachusetts: Boston, Worcester, and Springfield. And it shows that, this slide shows that in Boston, while African Americans accounted for slightly more than 1/3 of the student body, they represented 63% of all arrests and 70% of public order arrests, which is basically just means like kind of being disruptive, or the kind of very minor charge. This slide shows disparities in student arrests for Latino students in Springfield. It's a very similar trend here. And I just want to note that there's some good news on this front. There was a bill that has just passed the legislature, and it's on the governor's desk. I think I've heard that he's supposed to sign it by Saturday. This is actually part of the criminal justice reform bill. And within the broader, it's a huge bill, within the broader criminal justice reform bill is a bill that addresses student arrests specifically, and it eliminates the offense of disturbing school assembly for juveniles. So disturbing school assembly is the charge that is often used by police to arrest students in schools for relatively minor kinds of offenses. So when a student is just kind of being disruptive in the cafeteria, police can arrest a student and charge them for disturbing school assembly. So under this bill, that charge for juveniles would be completely eliminated. The bill also requires schools to have memoranda of understanding between the school district and the police department, and those memoranda would have to make clear that minor disciplinary offenses are best handled by the school community and not by police officers. So that's also contained in the legislation. And then finally, there are a few other tenets, but another important piece is that it requires data collection on school arrests. So right now, you can see the State Department of Education is collecting data on suspensions, which is great because we can see whether Chapter 222 is having an effect, whether the disparities are decreasing, et cetera. But as of now, schools are not reporting on student arrests, and that's a big problem because we don't know how often it's happening. It's just very hard to get the data. So this legislation requires schools to report, just as they do on suspensions, around student arrests. So the legislature has already voted on the bill, and it's just, we're looking to the governor at this point. So that's some good news. Okay, I think I've probably gone over my time. I am now going to rejoin the panel so that we can have a discussion about some of the things that we're trying to do to address these trends.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Liza, for that comprehensive overview. I think at this point, Maria and Liza, if you perhaps you could talk a little bit more about your current partnership, the School Exclusion Prevention Initiative.
Sure. So, Maria, do you want to start by just speaking a little bit about JRI and about the CBHI services that you're providing to families?
So I'm going to give you an overview of what CBHI services if you don't know what it means. So just a little historical background. This initiative became known due to a lawsuit that was done by parents who have mass health in collaboration with PPAL, which is Parent Professional Action. Thank you. That families who had mass health, especially the under marginalized communities, they would lag for months to years without having access to outpatient therapy, in-home behavioral, in-home therapy, and there was incidents that happened, and these families work with PPAL. And this passed. The Commonwealth was found negligent in supporting these families. So this came around the introduction of the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative. The Children's Behavioral Health Initiative is an interagency initiative of the Commonwealth, of the Executive Office and Human Services, whose mission is to strengthen, expand, and integrate Massachusetts services into a comprehensive, community-based system of care to ensure the families and their children with significant behavioral, emotional, and mental health needs obtain the service necessary to succeed in the home, school, and within their home community. A lot of these children were sent away to have services outside of their home community, so there was no connection to their parents, their community, who they were. So the CBHI Services works within a framework, and this framework is called Wraparound. It has 4 phases, and it's within the child and family team system. The Wraparound framework is an intensive method of engaging individuals with complex needs, most typically children, youth, adolescents, and their families, so that they can live in their homes and communities and realize their hopes and dreams, and also address their culture and who they are, and it's individualized, meeting the family where they're at.
Yeah, and I think I have to talk pretty close to this thing.
I know, it's hard.
So thank you for that description of the CBHI services that you're providing at JRI. At Mass Advocates for Children, Stephanie and I are working with a team of staff, both attorneys and non-attorneys, to do educational advocacy, both systemic advocacy, including legislative advocacy, but then also providing direct representation to families, and then also doing trainings for providers and parents. So we started this initiative, the School Exclusion Prevention Initiative, this year. It started in full force this fall, and it really grew out of a few cases that I had with JRI, in which it became pretty clear that it was a very effective way to accomplish case outcomes, was to establish a partnership between lawyers and social workers. As Maria described, JRI is already providing really comprehensive wraparound services in the community and the home for families, including, you know, therapeutic mentoring, therapy services, family support. But I was often hearing from JRI social workers and from families that one of the big gaps was the educational services that the students were receiving, and that the educational placements and services were often not appropriate for these students who had serious, you know, emotional and behavioral disabilities. So this prompted us to form this partnership, and there are a few main components of the partnership. The first is that Stephanie and I are providing trainings for the JRI staff and social workers around what the education laws say. So specifically, we're providing trainings around school discipline and around special education laws. And so that's so that the social workers can be more prepared and equipped to be going into the schools, you know, either at a suspension hearing or at an IEP team meeting, and they will kind of know what the parents' rights are, know what the students' rights are, and they will be able to help the parents to access those. We're also providing trainings, which we haven't started yet, but we're planning to provide trainings to parents themselves, both in English and Spanish. Stephanie is a native Spanish speaker. And we're looking forward to that piece as well, because the reality is that there aren't very many attorneys doing this work, and the way that this issue is really going to change is for parents to be empowered and to go into schools to know their rights, to change the system.
And what you're saying, Liza,
Yeah.
is completely correct. I see. So the training, not only that, the collaboration that Liza and Mac is doing with the CBHI services. So my role as a family partner, I am directly linked to the parent. The parent is the core of supporting these children, and as a family partner, I'm the peer mentor support. By providing the information and the knowledge, we can give that information to the parents, train them, coach them, model for them, so they're educated and they know their rights. A lot of these parents don't know their rights, especially if they're Spanish speaking. Let's not talk about it if they're undocumented. So this is crucial for our families, because we're there. We are the first line for them. We're in the home, we're in the community.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're providing that training. In addition, we provide, the second component is consultation, so that any of the JRI social workers at any point can call us. They're actually calling Stephanie, if they have a question about an educational situation, about placement, about services. If they have a student who was just arrested, a student who was just suspended, and they don't know what to do next, they can consult and talk through it with Stephanie. And then we do provide legal representation in a limited number of cases, and we're focusing specifically on the representation of students of color, Black and Latino students who have emotional and behavioral disabilities, who are facing some kind of disciplinary action. And the reason we're focusing on that population is because of the disparities that I described earlier. So far, it's been a really effective, dynamic partnership. We actually just did a training at JRI for the social workers yesterday, and I'm always amazed by how incredibly engaged and passionate they are. They're in the field every day. They're dealing with incredible barriers that are just almost unimaginable. You'll hear a little bit more about some of the cases that they're working on. And it's been a really powerful partnership so far.
And we do a truly multidisciplinary approach, because in our CBHI, CSA services, we have therapeutic mentors, behavioralists, outpatient therapeutic mentors, therapeutic training and support, ICCs, family partners. So the training is for all of us, and imagine how much of that work when we're out in the community with the schools, with other providers. So we're also training other providers to understand the disparities.
So powerful, so powerful. Could you share, Stephanie and Vinny, would you share a case example from your work to sort of illustrate how the school-to-prison pipeline plays out in your work?
So one of the youth that we currently work with, we're just going to call him Jay for the purpose of this presentation. So he's currently a 16-year-old African-American male who lives with his mom and 2 younger siblings in Boston. He currently attends a therapeutic day school in the greater Boston area, where he started at the beginning of this year. And he has an IEP for emotional impairment. He's been diagnosed with ADHD, PTSD, depression in the past, and currently also some challenges with attachment as well. And he's at pretty high risk in terms of where he lives in the community. There's a lot of community violence, substance use, and his mom also has her own mental health and medical needs as well. And so historically, in terms of his education, he's had difficulties in school, and including suspensions for sort of a lot of what Liza was saying about disturbing school assembly. So a lot of the behaviors, such as punching walls, lockers, being being disrespectful towards staff, and kind of missing class, wandering the halls, stuff like that. So this year at school, he's presented with a lot of anxiety, especially around wanting to leave the building or wanting to call his mom. And he's also been triggered a lot from arguments at home with his mom, either from the night before or the morning of before school. And so unfortunately, a lot of these mental health challenges and presentations that we see with Jay kind of quickly becomes criminalized from a school's perspective. Our goal for Jay and his family is, one, to find the appropriate educational settings. He's transitioned through a lot of different schools within the Boston area, and the team's also helping him to make effective progress in terms of managing his anxiety and sort of learning coping skills as well. So it's definitely hasn't been easy for this family to obtain the appropriate educational setting. It's just IEPs and meetings and all of that has been very difficult. And currently, his placement isn't working for him. He's been suspended multiple times. Just this year alone, he's been arrested 3 times, actually, also for the same reasons, disturbing school assembly. And I think that's why it was so great to have this partnership just in time with Stephanie.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about just kind of, so this is a pretty new case for me, so I kind of want to talk more about my goals, long-term goals for this case in terms of my legal interventions we can provide for this family. So my plan or my goal is 2 parts. So first, I want to represent Jay in suspension hearings at school to reduce the amount of school he is missing and make sure he's in class and getting those education services. And the second major goal is to obtain the proper special education placement for him and additional services for Jay to prevent further suspensions and arrests at school. And I also want to focus on helping Jay's mother navigate the special education process. It can be pretty daunting for these families. There's a lot of complicated rules and deadlines that it's tough for parents to keep track of all of that. So my goal is to make sure that she's aware of all of her rights, especially the importance of her role in the IEP team process. And I want to help the family obtain an independent educational evaluation for Jay in order to get an expert to provide an opinion on what services and support Jay actually needs in school to in order to make effective progress and be successful at school. He might need several assessments from outside experts, such as a neuropsychologist or a behaviorist's opinion. And we'd also like to get an expert to recommend the appropriate educational setting for Jay. We're not clinicians or attorneys, so we want to get an expert to opine on that. Then we can use their opinion to advocate for a placement with the school district that will work for Jay. And obtaining that appropriate placement will reduce, hopefully, the behavioral escalations that lead to the suspensions and other punitive forms of discipline. Another goal in my legal advocacy work is to reduce the number of police referrals when Jay is becoming dysregulated at school. So to accomplish that, I'm looking to request from the school that they conduct a functional behavioral assessment. So that assesses the function of his behaviors, the root causes, and just kind of give recommendations on how to manage that at school. And from those recommendations, look to develop a strong positive behavioral intervention plan that will then advocate that it be incorporated into Jay's IEP so that it's legally enforceable. So anything that's in his IEP, it's a legal document, so it's enforceable. That's basically, what my goals are in terms of my legal intervention in this case.
I think it's important to note too that is that me or?
Vinny, don't touch.
Is this working? No. Okay. Just important to note that currently Jay does have an IEP. He goes to a therapeutic day school, and the school does have a behavioral intervention plan for him, and has 3 arrests, but throughout this year, I think maybe best mobile crisis has been called maybe once. And so it's clearly sort of the behavioral plan or whatever the protocol that the school is taking clearly hasn't been working for him in addressing his mental health needs.
So they're looking at the behavior, but the child with this complex trauma and needs, they're not looking at what's causing the behavior. What's the cause? They're looking, so again, we're looking at a child of color, the racial bias, there's they're portraying Jay as a delinquent instead of a student who needs supports. And unfortunately, the system in Boston is set up in place out there, we're gonna send him to a therapeutic school. That is not the most appropriate placement for him. We have to look further. And unfortunately, a lot of our kids of color in the community get funneled into these specific therapeutic schools. It's not working for them. It may be for some children, but they have to look what is the most important for the individual child to succeed academically, socially, emotionally, and to have that self-esteem. Also, they're not including the parents. They see the parents are like, they don't care, they're not gonna come pick them up. That's not their job to pick up their children. It's their job to be there for meetings, but if they're not getting the notices for these meetings, how can they show up? They see these parents are not present. I have parents who say, well, they never called me. I show up and they say, oh, my son did this and that, he's suspended. That's disheartening for them. They see them as bad parents, but they're not. They just want to know what's going on. And if they don't know their rights, they feel helpless. They feel hopeless.
So, Vinny and Maria, from a social work perspective, can you talk a little bit further about sort of how this partnership with the attorneys really supports your work with clients in terms of sort of achieving clinical case outcomes for your clients?
Well, I actually have a quote from a parent. A parent said, oh my God, they're gonna help me? It's not gonna cost me anything?
Yes.
They talk in my own language? They're gonna go with me to school? Are you sure they're gonna show up? So this parent was literally in tears when I said, Stephanie speaks Spanish, she'll talk to you, she'll provide you the information in Spanish. And she's like, but this is what I needed because the school doesn't listen to me. They ignore me. So this parent was, I think you talked to her, but so it's, the other importance is the educational piece, especially Latino parents because, I'm a Mexican, so we as Latinos, in my home country and many other different countries, we see the educators as the experts. And how can we sort of question the educators? They have the best interest for my son or my daughter. So they feel like their hands are tied, they can't say anything. So when we have this knowledge that the MAC is providing us, we go back and say, look, I can teach you how to request an IEP. I can help you understand how to reconvene for an IEP meeting. You could be present, review your IEP, reject, accept, and sign it or not sign it. They're like, but then he's not going to get services. Or I have a parent who they emailed them their signed IEP and they never attended the IEP meeting. How is that possible? They're like, oh, here it is, and she's like, well, they said that's their IEP. They're going to get services now. I was like, no, that's illegal. You have a right to be there, and that's the kind of knowledge and wealth that would bring the families that we work with.
I just want to add, I mean, a huge part of our work with families is to empower them and to help them towards independence so that they can eventually do this without us. And I think this partnership has definitely provided families and actually us in terms of empowering the whole team to kind of know what is legal and what's not, what the school is supposed to do, what are some of the timelines that families or that schools should be held accountable for.
And how to hold them accountable.
Right, yes. And kind of just navigating communication with school and school discipline and all of that, and what the parents' rights are and what the students' rights are. It's really helped us get a better understanding to help families, but also to pass on to families as well.
So a lot of the issues also understanding that they have rights regardless whether they're undocumented or not. So a lot of parents will not route the boat because they're gonna out me to ICE. I'm not gonna, my son's not gonna educate it. How about if they deport me? What's gonna happen to my kid? So that's right now for the community that we live in.
Important to emphasize in the school, to the school, and in the IEP process. So it's been really helpful to work alongside them, and it really does inform our legal advocacy.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that as attorneys, we really don't have the clinical experience. We really don't bring those skills, and we definitely don't have the capacity to be doing the kind of intensive case management that Maria and Vinny are doing with these families day in and day out. And so I think the partnership really allows us to focus on the legal piece of the work so that Maria and Vinny can focus on the clinical work and the case management. And I think that's part of what makes it so effective. The other thing that I've noticed that I wasn't necessarily expecting, but it makes a lot of sense, that I think has been really invaluable about this partnership is that the JRI social workers are on the ground every day dealing with these issues. And so when we have conversations with them or we go in and train them, they are actually informing us about what are the patterns that are happening on the ground that we need to be concerned about from a systemic standpoint. So for example, one of the things that we learned very early on in our partnership with JRI was that the schools were calling parents repeatedly to ask them to come pick up their child from school that day. Not issuing a suspension, not providing notice and a hearing, which is required by law, but just calling the parent and saying, I think, Johnny's having a tough day. Why don't you come pick him up? Parents were coming to pick up their child. They were losing their jobs because they were called so often to come pick their children up. Sometimes schools were very friendly about it and said, he's having a rough day. I think it'd be better for you and for him and for everyone. Still, it's unlawful that they were doing that. But other times they would also threaten parents, essentially, and say, if you don't come pick up your child, we're going to call DCF, we're going to call the police. And so these are the kinds of practices that we really didn't have a sense of how pervasive the practices were until we started hearing about it from the JRI social workers. And now that is an issue that is front and center in MAC's systemic advocacy with the State Department of Education. It's an issue that we've written to the commissioner about. It's an issue that I'm advocating systemically on a weekly basis. And right now, the State Department of Education is looking to put out a new guidance, kind of interpreting the regs on this very issue of unreported suspensions, which are, schools calling parents and finding ways kind of around the discipline regulations. So we're hoping that the Department of Education is going to make sure that school principals and staff know these rules, know that parents have and students have due process rights, and that message gets out, and that these kind of practices of calling parents are not lawful, and that they need to be following the regulations. So that's one way in which the partnership has really informed, not only the daily legal work, but also the systemic advocacy.
And I think one of the things that the systemic part is everybody says, well, how is one parent going to change the system? Well, at least the system can change for that parent for that one time when they get a proper placement, the most appropriate placement for their child. They have a behavioral work around to ensure that the child stays in class. That the parent has a Spanish speaking, a Creole speaking, or whatever language they need to understand what is happening in their school.
So this is for the whole panel. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges in the work? Sort of on the ground, systemically, sort of what do we need, what's needed to move this, move the needle on this issue?
I think one of them is the core issue is the parent being part of the process. The parent, the law says that the parent is part of the team, that they have a voice in it. The parent's voice is silenced majority of the time. I think that's critical. That these parents are committed to bring the voice of themselves and the youth into the process. There needs to be more focus on school education, to threaten and protect, to really look at their strengths and the protective factors that they have, that the family feels safe. Again, when I talk about sort of growing up, for me in the 70s, I heard a lot of immigrants saying that they were in the shadows because they were undocumented. We're starting to see that trend again. These families going back in the shadows. That's one of the biggest barriers that I see. That they're not going to seek services for their children.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think one of the greatest barriers that I see in this work is the systemic cultural change that's needed in the schools in order to shift, the conversation from a conversation about a delinquent child, or a adolescent who's engaging in criminal behavior to a child who has emotional, behavioral, mental health disabilities and background of trauma that needs to be supported in school instead of excluded from school. And that is an incredibly hard shift to make. It's incredibly hard, and it's not something, we do a lot of work as attorneys in terms of enforcing the laws, which is really important, and passing and implementing these laws, which is critical work, but it actually doesn't really shift the hearts and minds of, kind of the teachers and the school administrators and the school resource officers, the police officers who are arresting these kids. And I find that to be the biggest challenge, hands down, is to figure out how do you shift the culture of a school. And like I said, there are oftentimes, people within the system and within schools who really do get it, who are trying to reverse these trends. And then there are others who don't. And oftentimes it's a broader cultural issue and it's a broader systemic issue. And really figuring out how to get in there and shift that, I find to be one of the biggest challenges.
I think also a piece is that the educators, administrators, and schools seeing the teams and the parents as allies instead of adversaries. To see when the teams come in with a family, we're not saying you're doing it wrong. We're just saying let's help you understand what the family and the child needs, and we want to make your job easier because educators, their job is hard. We know that. We're helping them be trained because we know that they don't have the accessibility to being trained within the different disciplines, or have accessibility to different systems like we do. So I think that's one of the biggest things that's a barrier for us, that the administration, the educators, at times see us as adversaries.
I just want to add one more in terms of like my work and what I see as being very challenging is sort of working with these schools or working with at administratives at schools who are supposed to know these laws and regulations, and but you know, we're the ones who need to remind them of these laws and regulations. So I think that makes it very challenging for us and the families.
Great, yeah. So we have about a half an hour left, and so at this point we'd like to turn it over to you all to give you an opportunity to ask questions of our experts here on the panel. You know, we want to hear from as many people as possible, so please keep your questions concise, and you know, if you have additional comments and want to have discussions, we are going to be available. The panelists will be available after the discussion. But does anyone have any questions for the panel? Over here, yeah. We're recording, so if you don't mind speaking into the microphone, that would be great.
I'm very impressed with the partnership, and I'm just wondering the role of poverty and the partnership between legal social workers, even though your focus is school rights and access to equal education, but also looking at the causes of some of the difficulties in schools and the difficulties that parents are having to access their rights by the challenges that they face with poverty, with homelessness, with food, with all of those things, and how deep you're able to get into that, and how much you're able to partner with some of the community organizations that work on that.
That's a great question. Good question. Yeah, great question.
I mean, that's exactly part of the wraparound process. Part of, as an intensive care coordinator and family partner does a lot of that too, is to connect families with community resources, any resources that they might need for the family, for the youth. So it's not only, we don't only provide mental health, or we don't only focus on the mental health and behavioral health piece. It's really, we look at families holistically, and so a lot of the times, yeah, family partners have accompanied families to DTA office, the SSI office, and try to advocate for families to have equal access to things that might help them.
So as a family partner, one of the criteria for being a family partner within the CSA CBHI services is to have lived experience. Being the caretaker or having a child of who has social, emotional, mental health, and physical health, and you know, I have all those. So the core of a family partner's work is to support, educate, advocate for, and enhance the skills the parents already have, but with everything that's happening around them, you know, just having food on the table, a roof over their heads, the basic necessities to survive, doesn't mean that they don't care about the children. So we connect them, we ensure that they identify natural supports, and sort of my phrase that I give the families I work with is like, in our home countries, we had our village. Let me help you realize that you have a village here with your coaches, community centers, teachers, churches, family member, maybe a family member that has you no longer speak to them. Can we help you mend that relationship? We also see, they say, I don't have anybody. And we really sit down and map out their sort of their social circle. And we realize that, you know, they talk to their pastor once in a while, or they have the neighbor that they share. You know, I'll take care of your kid one day. I'll take care of your kid the next week. So we help them identify those sustainable skills, because CBHI service is supposed to be short term. So it's a holistic wraparound. We are in all domains. We identify the needs in all domains. They identify what their needs are. We work as a team to identify goals, objectives, interventions, and how we're going to measure success. So it's a holistic approach.
And then maybe just quickly from the legal perspective, I mean, poverty is obviously a huge factor. All of our clients are living in deep poverty for the most part. And so that's something that our organization has a lot of expertise in terms of working with clients who are living in poverty. And we also will work in collaboration with other legal services agencies to address other issues other than just education. So we might make referrals to Greater Boston Legal Services or another legal services agency if the family needs help getting connected to benefits, cash assistance, or SNAP food stamps, or if they need housing and help applying for subsidized housing, or if they're facing family homelessness. I actually have a background working with families facing homelessness and accessing shelter. So that's something that we see that also oftentimes interferes with education when kids, become homeless and maybe in shelters and placed in shelters all over the state, and the children are disconnected from school. So that's something we try to take into account in our work, and then also kind of work with other attorneys and with people across disciplines to address those factors, which are really critical. How much are the schools, so the question was, how much are the schools aware of this? Of what? Of the part that all of this plays in students coming to school and how they present themselves? In the role that poverty plays in children getting to school and in all of this. I think that in my experience that schools are very aware of the role that poverty plays. I think that from what I've seen, teachers and staff, for the most part, are working really hard, and they are up against poverty and challenges, and kids coming in having experienced trauma, and are oftentimes really doing their best, and sometimes don't have the resources or tools to really manage it effectively, or the right systems to manage it effectively. But I think individual teachers and staff, many of them are very aware of the issues, and maybe just kind of don't have the resources or tools to know how to manage it because it's so overwhelming.
I mean, from a provider's perspective too, a lot of the wraparound team also sort of can share not only poverty but any other barriers, right, challenges in a youth's life, and we try to empower parents to do that and kind of have that direct communication with the school about the other sort of outside, very real challenges.
And also you have to take in consideration a lot of these families, they've been shamed. There's a lot of shame behind that. And being able to be that exposed to school when they already feel like they think I'm a bad parent. And also we look at every family as individuals. What do you want to share? And we educate them, what should you share and what's gonna be helpful for you to share. Again, we are very mindful of their culture, their beliefs, and that's another core of our work. It's very individualistic. We have some families will put it all on the table, this is what I need. In other families, it's a trickle, trickle, trickle. And other families have just been burned by the system. They grew up in the system, and providers have time and time again have not done what they were supposed to. And some of these families, it takes us 9 months even to get through the door at times, but we're persistent and we give them the respect, and then they see that we're there for them.
We have a question in the back corner.
Good evening. My name is Sharice, and I wanted to thank all of you personally for helping to continue the conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline. My question, and hopefully you all have some type of different experience with it, is how have you seen the school-to-prison pipeline affect girls of color?
I think girls, I have a few cases that I work individually with girls. They are seen more as, they're not arrested right away. They give them a little bit more leeway. They're like, you're too dramatic. They will call services immediately for girls of color. For boys, it's like you're going to the dean. They call the police. They will call the best team more often than the police for girls of color. But they also get stigmatized, like you're the troublemaker. So right away something's wrong, she did it. And so they know, other peers know that they can target it. So then they get defensive. And then they say that she has an attitude. So then again, the cycle is there's something wrong with her.
That's also definitely been my experience, that arrests are much less or fewer for females. I think also
But they're also more likely to be put in residential facilities as well.
I was gonna say, I think
Yeah.
the time frame, for some reason, that it takes to be transferred to like a higher level of care, even like within the school system, for some reason it just happens quicker. So if the person is in inclusion school, very quickly it goes to a therapeutic day program, and then to like an out-of-district therapeutic school.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note, it's a great question, that the research does show that girls of color, particularly black girls, are disproportionately disciplined as compared to white girls, and will be disproportionately disciplined for things like being disrespectful, which I think is very much linked to racial bias. We actually, Stephanie and I were at a Cradle to Prison Pipeline conference this morning, in which there was some data shown on the offenses that white students are more likely to be suspended for were things like smoking or, property destruction, things that are very, very concrete, whereas particularly African American students were more likely to be disciplined for things like being disrespectful or being too loud. Things like that, where you can just see the racial bias seeping right into that system, and that's absolutely affecting the research, and the data shows that that's affecting girls of color, and black girls in particular.
We have a question over here.
I also want to respond.
Sure.
Also with girls, we see that they're more likely to be victimized in the school setting. And they're more likely to be victimized within the school setting, and not and the school not responding well, either through bullying or through sexual harassment. And often with sexual harassment, schools do not respond adequately, so girls drop out of school at quite a higher rate now, increasingly higher rate now, and become disengaged, and then can get caught up into a system that again will get them into prison.
That's a good point.
Yeah, exploitation is rampant in a lot of the families that we work with, and a lot of them are girls of color. Unfortunately, one of the biggest places that they're exploited is at school.
Hi, my name is Fran, and I work for the Early Years Project in the Cambridge School Department. And you had just mentioned that it's sometimes called the Cradle to Prison Pipeline. And the reason is, I think, because preschoolers are often expelled. Back in 2005, Walter Gilliam from Yale University looked at the expulsion rate of preschoolers. We're talking about 3-, 4-, and 5-year-old children. And in Massachusetts, he found that the children were 13 times more likely to be expelled when they were in preschool or in childcare than from elementary to high school. And very much like the research that you showed us, African American children 4 times more likely than white Latinos were 2 times more likely than white children, and boys were expelled 50% more than white children. As a result of that, the Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care requires that licensed child care centers self-report when a child is expelled. But of course, we don't know how often that is happening. Really hard to assess. So I have 2 questions. One is, does Mass Advocacy for Children and JRI address expulsion of children who are 3- to 5-year-olds or work with their parents?
So we have seen this trend of students who are very young being expelled and suspended from school. We have been interested in the possibility of pursuing legislation specifically around preschool suspensions, because we really don't believe that any preschooler should ever be suspended. I mean, you hear these stories about like a preschooler throwing Play-Doh, and they're going to get suspended for that, and so that is something that we've talked about on the systemic level. In terms of our partnership, We do provide representation on behalf of younger children, but the youngest children right now on our caseload tend to be a little bit older than the category you're talking about. That we mostly deal with students who are, kindergarten and older. But we do have, and I think I'm glad you asked this question, because we do have a lot of younger students, kind of 9, 10-year-olds on our caseloads who are being harshly disciplined and suspended. And I don't know, maybe Stephanie could talk a little bit about one of her cases for a younger student where you're really talking about a pretty young student who's being criminalized at a very young age.
Yeah, so one of the biggest surprises coming into this work was seeing just the age demographic. It's all younger, that was shocking to me, just seeing 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds consistently being suspended from school. And so one of the parents I work with, her son, I think maybe when he was 6 or 7, someone from the school staff, so he was getting suspended pretty often, and they kind of told mom that your son is a delinquent, and it's like, this is a 6-7-year-old that you're calling a delinquent. He's, anyway, so it's just like very frustrating to hear these things, just and just seeing how young it starts. And I actually just got a call today about a 5-year-old who's being just excluded from school, and that's just really troubling to hear that it's starting this early.
I think an interesting question to ask that family is if the child was in child care, and was that child either suspended when he was younger?
So it started, according to mom, he started getting suspended in like kindergarten. So K1 or K2, that's when she started, or those suspensions started. And it's just so early. It's shocking.
Sorry, I was just going to add, in terms of our partnership, our program specifically, the qualifications are that the youth has to be under the age of 21 and have a serious, they call it serious emotional disturbance. And so for kids to qualify for our services, there typically does need to be some sort of like mental health
That's
difficulties
okay.
or anything. So we don't
do that
have
work.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of like young kids. I think
have someone on case, but I don't think they're in school yet.
yeah, there's very, like, we have very few
Very few
youth who are
I would say so far.
so yeah.
So my second,
now.
yeah. So my second question is, if any of you are familiar with research that's been done with prisoners to find out how often they were expelled during their school years.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there has been research done on that, and I don't have it right in front of me, but certainly, I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done that shows very clearly that the more a student is suspended, the more likely they are to become disengaged in school, to be retained in school, the more likely they are to drop out, and the more likely they are to end up in the criminal justice system. And I think there was a reference at the conference this morning about if you go to any of the local prisons in Massachusetts and see kind of what grade they reached, no one will have above an 11th grade education. If you're really looking at those kinds of educational outcomes and that achievement gap, I think it starts with, or one of the main components is school exclusion and suspension, because ultimately if kids are not in school, they can't be learning and they can't be, achieving to the next grade. So I think there's very much a direct correlation in that regard.
So if children already have that message early on that they're delinquents, school refusal for our adolescents is huge. If you don't feel that the teachers are there for you, and as soon as they see you, they're like, you're a delinquent, who's going to want to go to school? Who's going to want to be there if they feel that as soon as you see me, you would have perception of who I am instead of really finding out what my needs are.
Is preschool mandated or paid for in this state?
It's not mandated.
Not mandated. Okay.
No, when younger kids, it's a lottery.
Lottery. Okay.
Yeah, so if you're lucky enough to get it.
Yeah, kids with disabilities are entitled to start receiving services at age 3, but for other students, it generally public education starts in kindergarten.
So it sounds like we can agree that there aren't enough services in the schools for administrators, staff, and teachers in terms of like the funding, the skills, the knowledge to give or ensure an equal education for everyone, and that childhood trauma and poverty plays a big role. My question is, how much more is required? Like, how close are we to that ultimate goal of equality, and why aren't we there right now? What's in the way?
Just a softball. Yeah, I would say we're pretty far.
Yes.
I mean, the achievement gaps are huge. If you're looking again at the achievement gaps specifically for students with disabilities, low-income students, and students of color, the achievement gaps are huge. So even though, for example, in Massachusetts, we're often touted as being #1 in the country for education and test scores, we also happen to be #1 in the country for disparities and the achievement gap. And I think that that's where we really need to be focusing attention. I think absolutely more resources are needed for education. There's no question about that. But I also think we could be allocating our resources differently. I think one really important alternative that I mentioned earlier is restorative justice, for example, which is kind of a different model that could be used in the schools that actually wouldn't really be taking many more resources, maybe initially in order for everyone to be trained, but ultimately it would be the same staff, but just interacting with their students in a different way, and where students really had more of a voice in the process. And when something goes wrong, instead of excluding a student from school, you're really having the students sit down and talk about what happened, who was harmed, and how can that harm be repaired. And that's actually been proven through many research studies to be much more effective in terms of changing behavior, in terms of keeping schools safe, in terms of keeping students engaged. So I think it is about increasing resources, absolutely, and I think it's also about thinking really hard about the models and values and philosophies that we're using in our schools. Well, so why are the resources not allocated fairly? I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's an issue that goes back to historic racial discrimination. I think it's very much linked to residential segregation in this country. I mean, schools are still very racially segregated, and you see in inner city urban schools that are primarily students of color that don't have the resources, and then you go to the suburbs and, you know, just a few miles away, you know, where property values are higher, you have students getting a world-class education. And so I think you really need to be looking not only at education policy, but also at housing policy and residential segregation, which is very much linked to kind of historic discrimination that I think, you know, everyone in this room is really aware of. But it's, yeah, these are good questions. I don't know if anyone else in the audience wants to take a shot at them, or
That's way out my scope.
or if you have thoughts yourself.
Well, I want to know, how can we help the communities that are directly affected by this inequity advocate for themselves better on a policy level, at the state level, or at the local level? And how can we as allies advocate better? I know you all are already talking about legislation you're working with, but if we had more support, if we had more voters or future voters to talk about this like we do with the gun violence thing that's suddenly blown up, that might finally see more change at the state level.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I forgot the day. So yesterday, a lot of the nonprofits who are working, especially with the marginalized community, rallied at the Capitol here in Massachusetts to talk about these disparities and the lack of funding, the cutting of the funds. So, you know, finding out when those days of rally to support, you know, connect yourself with an organization, whether it be JRI or any other organization, to go in and have more voices out there to say that this is needed. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is part of the work that we're trying to do right now. I mean, we're really trying to empower parents and trying to mobilize them so that they can be in the schools enforcing their rights. And that's huge, even to just get to that point. where parents know their rights and can go in and have the skills to really enforce them. And I think, once we get to that point, that's when things are going to start to shift in the system. It's not when there's like 1 or 2 attorneys around, doing this. It's when parents are informed and they're going in and they're changing the system and they're helping to educate, the school administrators who may not know that these are their rights and these are the laws. And so that's part of the work that we're trying to do, while at the same time engaging in legislative and systemic advocacy. And we also which is very much informed by the experience of families on the ground, and we try to bring them as much as possible into the systemic advocacy as well. So I think these are all really important points, and we're certainly doing everything we can to address these broader issues.
We have time for one final question. Does anyone have a final question? Over here? Great. On this side of the room. Sure.
We've been talking a lot about schools and community, but I haven't heard anything about the police force being involved in any way, and I was wondering if there are any efforts in that direction.
So great question. So yes, there have been efforts. I spoke briefly earlier about the legislation that we're working on around student arrests. And so that's legislation that looks like it is going to go through, and that's going to hopefully reduce student arrests in the sense that it will eliminate the offense of disturbing school assembly, and it will require there to be memoranda of understanding between school districts and police departments that make it more clear kind of what kinds of offenses should be handled by the police, what kinds of offenses should be handled by the school. The vast majority should be handled by the school. Very rarely should the police be getting involved. So that's one response. But in terms of I think what you're also asking is maybe have police been kind of trained on these kinds of issues and that kind of thing. And they have. There are organizations that have been doing training with police across the state around the school-to-prison pipeline and around kind of how to engage more positively with students. I mean, from my perspective, I'm not sure why we need police officers in schools, honestly. But there are trainings for them to be kind of interacting in a more positive way with students and to be more clear about kind of what their role is. And so that training is happening. But again, there are sometimes philosophical differences, and I do think I'm glad you brought it up, because I do think it's really important for us to be making efforts to work across that divide and to be trying to talk with police forces about this issue, and not just see them as an adversary, but try to have those conversations. So it's a really important point.
So some of the things that I do with my families that I work with is a lot of the times the youth have complex trauma, PTSD, ADHD, they might have autism as well with one of their diagnoses. So we actually go down to their district police, we talk to the police that are there, we introduce who their child is, what are their mannerisms, like it's a lot of work, but the parents are willing to do that so they know who their child is. So if they see them in the community on their way to school or at school, they have a face and they understand what their motivation behind that incident may be. Not that he wants to be assaultive, he wants to disturb the peace. Something's happening with him, and maybe the tone of voice that they use, the way they approach the child. So when they're in a heightened manic state, they're not going to respond. So parents actually have done that, and we've been doing that for years. And even if one parent has gone to every single police station in the city of Boston to make sure that, one, her child doesn't get shot because he's a child of color, and two, she wants him to know that they're there to help him.
For the Boston Police Department, and so that's something kind of exciting for us. But they're sending her through the School of Social Work here, so she can train all of the other police officers. specifically on how to do things like this and be more trauma informed.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. So we have about 5 more minutes, and I'm just going to turn it over to the panelists for final comments. What are some, some of the most important takeaways for us to think about in terms of trying to combat this issue, similar to the question that was asked? Yeah. You want to start over here?
Thanks. So I want you all to see this work that we do to take it down to the minute level, to understand that it's an overwhelming system. We want to, of course, we want to start at the highest level, but by moving the goals to the most minute level and working our way up, sort of a scaffolding effect, we can slowly chip away of these barriers, these disparities. This is how I teach parents. Don't look at the bigger picture, because if you look at the bigger picture, they're overwhelmed, they're depression, they stop. So we just want to break it down to the smallest minute goal and just start your way up.
I think something that we can all individually do, whatever your job is, whatever your position is to really educate yourself in terms of familiarize yourself with the rules and regulations within school systems. And in terms, like in our experience working with families, there's a lot of myths out there that, families talk, communities just kind of, I never really looked at the law myself, and so there's a lot of families take on these myths and believe them to be true. And I think one thing that we can all really do is educate ourselves and then, pass it along to people we work with.
I want to say that, I think that this partnership, it's very new, and I think that we just need to have like a continued collaboration between social workers and attorneys to tackle these tough issues and kind of, help break those barriers and stop, the school to prison pipeline or the cradle to prison pipeline. I think that this collaboration needs to keep happening. We need more attorneys involved in it. There aren't that many that do this type of work, so it's just really important to educate everyone about the need. So I would say that.
Yeah, and I would echo what Stephanie said about the importance of these kinds of interdisciplinary partnerships. I think are really important, and they're not all that common. I think the work that we're doing and the way in which we're doing it is really effective and has the potential to produce some really great outcomes for individual families and then also have a broader impact. There are some other partnerships similar to ours out there, like I know Health Law Advocates and the Children's Mental Health Campaign has a JMAP, which is now I think MAP, Mental Health Advocacy Project, which is a similar model of working together with the DCF Family Resource Centers and also with some CBHI providers and using attorneys as well. So that's a partnership model that I think is kind of gaining some steam, and I think it's one that's effective that we should continue to support and pursue. But then I also think that we need to take a really multifaceted approach. I know that's what we try to do at MAC. It's not just the direct representation, but it's also the legislative advocacy. It's also administrative advocacy, working with leadership in school districts, working with the State Department of Education, passing laws, and then working to implement those laws, and then working on the ground with social workers and with educators and with others to make sure that they're kind of comprehensively and holistically implemented. And I just wanted to also emphasize that one of the main takeaways, I think, if we're really going to kind of shift this conversation, is to, really try to build a collaboration and a partnership with schools as well, and for them to actually feel like they're in the driver's seat of creating some of this culture change. And our organization we were able to pass a law called Safe and Supportive Schools, which is all about kind of schools taking the lead in terms of determining what they need in order to shift the culture in their own school and to implement trauma-sensitive practices. So I think that really partnering with schools, and others in the system is going to be really important. Restorative justice is another, I think, really effective model that we should be looking at in order to really shift the needle on this issue. So that's all to say that I don't think that there's one solution. I think we need to be tackling this issue from all angles, and I think the work that we're doing and the work that all of you are doing is incredibly important.
Great. Well, I loved this panel. I really just love this panel. I think that the work that you are doing is tremendous. I mean, it is so necessary, and I want to thank you for your amazing and inspirational work. And, you know, all of you for your very thoughtful comments. And I'm certain that all of you, as we took the poll in the beginning, are in education and social work and public health and law. And I want to just reiterate that I completely agree with you around these partnerships. These partnerships are critical. We all bring different expertise to the table, and all really need to work together to combat this really important issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.